Good morning. We are starting with chapter 1 of our family law book, and you have other assignments that are on Blackboard. So if you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me or email Jenna Fox at the school. Okay? So we're starting on family law. Family law is a really big, broad topic. We're going to cover termination of marriage. We're going to figure out what a marriage is, first of all, then we're going to figure out how you terminate it. We are going to talk about child support and parental rights and responsibilities, which most of us just call custody. We're going to figure out what happens with spousal support, which used to be called alimony. We're going to talk about what happens after you terminate a marriage or after you have a support order. How do you modify that? How do you terminate those orders? So there's a lot to cover in this semester under the umbrella of family law. It's not just divorce law. It's not just juvenile court law or domestic relations law. There's a lot to cover. So we're going to start with chapter 1, which just gives you an introduction. Okay? Let's start with the family law court systems. I'm going to focus on Ohio. I used to do family law for many, many years. And most family law courts are housed in a domestic relations court and a juvenile court. So domestic relations court is where if you have that golden ticket of a marriage certificate, that court has authority through statutes to handle the termination of your marriage, to handle custody issues, modification issues, spousal support issues. The key is, in domestic relations court, you must have a marriage certificate. What if you don't have that? Well, then you've done things in the wrong order, first of all, and you're probably going to end up in juvenile court. Now, what does that mean? Juvenile court is set up not for people who cohabitate and then split up. The court system thinks you're an adult. You made those decisions. If contractually you have some kind of an understanding, you can go to a different court, not domestic relations court because you don't have a marriage certificate. Maybe municipal court, court of common pleas if it's something really big. But juvenile court is there for handling all issues that concern children who are born outside of marriage. In the law, we call children who are born within a marriage that they are born as issue of marriage. In juvenile court will deal with custody issues, child support issues, for those children who are born outside of marriage. Okay? So typically, most counties in Ohio have two separate courts. The juvenile court system, which you may think, well, the juvenile court, that's for criminal stuff for juveniles. Yes, that is a division of juvenile court. There's also a division of juvenile court that deals with abuse and neglect of children. And there is a division of juvenile court that deals with custody, parental rights and responsibilities, and paternity for children who are born outside of marriage. So most counties, children born outside of marriage, juvenile court. Most counties will have a separate division of their court of common pleas that is specifically for domestic relations court. Now, it really kind of depends on how big the county is, right? If you're in a small county where there's only one court of common pleas judge, that judge is going to do everything, including domestic relations. There probably will still be a separate juvenile court, but as far as divorce is concerned, the Court of Common Pleas decides if it's a big enough county, if they're going to divide up the judge's responsibilities and designate one domestic relations court. Okay? That's most counties. Now, there are some counties that say, you know what? This is a big mishmash. I think we're just going to put everything that has to do with marriage and children who are born outside of marriage into one court. And they designate that as a family court. That family court will deal with children born within as issue or outside of marriage. We'll deal with termination of marriage. We'll deal with abuse and neglect cases. We'll deal with a myriad of issues that have to do with children and marriage. The one thing you need to understand is, even though this is a family court and everything is under one umbrella in one court, they still won't divide up your stuff if you're not married. Okay? Yeah, I need to be very clear about that. If you are not married and you cohabitate, and then you end that cohabitation, dividing up your stuff is your problem. There is no statutory authority for a domestic relations court or a family court to divide up your stuff. You made that contractual arrangement. It's your job to straighten it out. Now, why do I say it really is the statutory authority of the court? Well, a court can only do what it has jurisdiction or authority to do. Where does it get that authority from? The legislature, from statutes. So there's a whole section of every state's code of conduct, statutes, that deals with what domestic relations court or family court or juvenile court has jurisdiction to do. They do not have jurisdiction to split up your stuff if you're not married. I've had many cases, many cases, where you have people who've cohabitated and then have a child and so are in juvenile court figuring out child support, paternity, child support, and custody. And then they'll look at me and say, yeah, but we bought a house together. What do we do about that? I don't know. You're not going to go to juvenile court to fix it, and you're not going to go to domestic relations court to fix it. So either you guys hire me to hammer out some kind of an agreement where you sell the house or one person buys the house and you split up your stuff, or one of you files a lawsuit against the other one in municipal court or common pleas court. It gets messy. Okay? You're going to hear me say many times during this semester, the system is set up for you to do things in a certain order. There is a reason for all of the rules, the policies that are in place when it comes to family law. Okay? And one of them is to do things in the right order. So beware, if you wish to live together, there is a process. Okay? Now, your book talks about the roots and traditions of American family law. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of marriage and then how that idea of marriage migrated to the United States and kind of where we are right now. Marriage was originally a religious, social construct. Okay? If you were within a religious group, part of any religion's belief system is to promulgate itself into the future and to have order in doing that, social order in doing that. In Judeo-Christian belief system, which is really the basis of the United States judicial system, marriage started as a religious social construct so that there could be orderly procreation, and then orderly continuation of that particular social structure within that religion. Okay, why do I say that? Okay, if you are trying to build a community, if you are trying to build a community that's based on a specific moral code, well, how do you do that in the most orderly fashion? Well, you put one man, one woman together. They have a family, which is a social structure within the larger community. And then that family will impart the belief system of the community with the children. The children will interact in the community, and the community grows. Right? So any one of the Judeo-Christian belief systems embraces the idea of orderly growth with a family unit. And that's where marriage comes from, 6,000 years ago. Okay? It started with Judaism that recognized that women were more than just chattel. Chattel is a legal word that means property and needed to be treated with respect. And so within Jewish tradition, which then translates to Christian tradition, women are treated within a marriage with certain respect, and upon termination of a marriage with certain respect. And termination of a marriage is not something that we like, because it disrupts the entire order of the community. Okay? That's the beginning of marriage, 6,000 years ago, right? And that's Judaism, and then Christianity picked that up, right? And you started with the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox Church, again, really placing a high value on marriage, especially with the idea of creating a family, so that you have stability within that religious/social construct. Then you have all of the Protestant denominations that come off of the Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Byzantine Church, if we really want to throw them in there. And you have slight modifications of what a marriage is and the roles within a marriage and how you terminate a marriage, if you're allowed to terminate a marriage. But it's really a religious idea. Okay? Those religious ideas kind of culminated and came to a head in conflict with secular ideas with Henry VIII. Who's Henry VIII? Well, Henry VIII was one of the kings of England. And at the time of Henry VIII, everybody was under the auspices of the Pope and the Catholic Church. So what happened? Henry VIII couldn't get an heir to the throne. He was getting married, can't have a kid, killing his wives, right? Had 8 wives. And it got really out of hand. Why was he doing that? Well, because the Catholic Church said, you can't terminate a marriage. We don't do that. It is the antithesis of what our religious goals are in procreation and growing our social/religious community. But Henry VIII was killing people, killing all his wives. And so the religious people within England came to him and said, you know what? We had a dream. And we think that you should be a new pope of a new church where you can do divorce. Well, Henry VIII thought that was a pretty good idea. You know why? When people go to church and they put money in the plate, if he's the head of the church, where's the money going? To him. So he was like, okay, I don't have to kill these women. He didn't really care because it's kind of crazy. But I don't have to kill these women, and I can get a divorce, and I get to get rich on top of everything else. I'm in. And that was the birth of the Episcopalian Church. And why do I say that that is kind of the beginning of secular needs, the state's needs, versus religious needs when it comes to marriage? Well, the King of England was the head of the government, secular, away from religion. Now he was both the head of the church, the religious part, and the head of the government. Made a merging of this idea of a secular marriage and a religious marriage. Okay? Fast forward. We are now colonizing what will be the United States. People are fleeing to the United States for religious freedom because, as you can imagine, the King of England says, you don't want to be in my church? I'm killing you. Right? So people were hightailing it out of England. People were hightailing it out of Europe because there was a Great Awakening and there were all kinds of challenges to the Pope, and the Pope didn't like that either. And so people were getting on boats that were held together with chewing gum and rubber bands and floating over to the colonies for religious freedom. So the colonies were set up basically with a religious bent. Massachusetts was run by the Puritans. If you wanted to be married in the colony of Massachusetts, you had to go through their religious order to get married. And they were probably an intolerant bunch. They kicked a bunch of people out. Guess where they went? Rhode Island. And Rhode Island said, yeah, we have religious marriages, but it's a little different from over in Massachusetts. Right? You had the Dutch settling in New York. Catholics, Lutherans, you wanted to get married. That's how you did it. We had a different kind of Christianity with the Pennsylvania Dutch who settled in Pennsylvania. You had Quakers, you had a lot of Lutherans, they came from Germany, right? If you wanted to get married, you went through there. They were religious constructs, but they intertwined with the communities of their states. Each state had its own, or each colony, which then became a state, had its own kind of religious flavor. And because it had its own religious flavor, it had its own flavor of how the communities within that colony operated. Makes sense, doesn't it? Because within a religious framework, you build a larger community. Okay? Fast forward. We are now the United States of America. Spoiler alert, we won the revolution. And now the state is becoming a little bit more important in our world. The state in the late 1800s started saying, we don't really like some of these religious orders that allow polygamy, marriage of more than one woman. We don't think that that's really cool. So we're going to start passing laws about that. We think that we need some guardrails. So in order to get married, you can get married in your religious institution, but we want to make sure that people aren't getting married more than once, having polygamous marriages, marrying children. We have an interest in making sure that we have kind of a baseline. Even though it's a religious institution, we have a baseline of what we in our state's community thinks is appropriate. And so states started passing laws, right? A lot of them had to do with, you can't marry your horse. And literally, there are lots and lots of states that have that particular law on the books. You can't marry someone of the same sex. I'm talking 1800s. You can't marry children younger than a certain age. You can't marry more than... And those were kind of the guidelines, right? You have to be a certain age to get married. And we're only really going to say in our state, reflecting the religious morality of the people in our state, that this kind of marriage is okay. was okay. The state kind of had an interest in making sure that we had a baseline. But then the state, as governments are prone to do, thought, you know what? We can make a little money off of this. We're charging people for a marriage license and a marriage certificate. Maybe we can have a little more control over this. And the idea of a secular marriage that is sanctioned by the state became almost as important as the religious marriage. Why? Because the state started tying more and more things to a secular marriage. Social Security. When Social Security came into play in the 1930s, you had to be legally married. Legally married, not religiously married. Legally married should be secularly married. Okay, well then you don't get Social Security or death benefits or workers' comp benefits or any kind of benefit. The state started defining other government benefits as the government grew and had more benefits to dole out, defining who could get what, and a religious marriage wasn't good enough. The secular marriage almost took precedent over the religious marriage. Okay? All right, we're going to fast forward again. We're in our time machine and we're going to go to the 1960s. It was a good decade. I was born then. And in the 60s, we had something called the sexual revolution, right? Where we had the women's movement saying, you know, we don't want to just be barefoot and pregnant and tied to the stove and subservient to men, none of which was true, by the way, because, again, if you're in a religious marriage, there are certain things that are specifically afforded to women within that marriage. But it was a way to manipulate women who didn't have to go outside and beat clothes to clean them on a rock with running water. We had a new age of automation, and women were kind of bored. And you had Marxists come in and say, you know what, you deserve better. You don't need a man. Divorce him. Well, divorce wasn't really a thing in the 1960s. Why? Again, going back to religious marriages, it's really counterproductive to growth of a healthy society. Instability. Right? Divorce creates instability. Well, that instability spills out into the community, and then the community doesn't grow, and it dies. And, you know, religious organizations knew that, and that's why divorce was discouraged. So, in the 1960s, things kind of got turned on their head. In the 1960s, we had women convinced that they deserved more, needed more, and started divorcing men. Well, I remember being a kid and seeing the cover of Time magazine, which most of you don't even know existed back then, but a magazine that everybody had on their coffee table that said the new poverty. And it was women with children who had divorced their husbands. Because the system wasn't set up for it. Right? The statutes hadn't been written. As is the case with most legislation, it has to catch up to what's happening in society. And so the 60s and 70s were a really turbulent time. Because women were saying, I want to be in the workplace, but they had children. And men were saying, I'd like to see my children, but there weren't laws that protected their rights. And you had this whole new class of people who were in poverty that ended up marrying the government. Because the roles within the marriage traditionally had been broken. You had chaos. You had new courts that were being created. Juvenile court was created in the 70s and 80s and 90s in most states to handle children that were born out of wedlock. It was a very, very, very turbulent time. And that is kind of what gets us to the 21st century. where divorce, unfortunately, is pretty common. And a good number of people don't have a religious ceremony. They simply go and have a secular ceremony. And they rely upon the rules of the state rather than the rules of their community for putting together a marriage. A lot of people don't get married. Within certain demographics, up to 70% of children are born outside of marriage. Depends on the demographic, depends on the age, depends on the location. But through the 70s, 60s, and 70s, this whole core idea of marriage being central to a functioning, successful community and society has been torn apart and supplanted with, well, marrying the government, where the government provides what the marriage used to provide: a home, money, childcare, food. It's kind of where we are right now. We used to have alimony, and we're going to spend a lot of time on alimony and spousal support, but that was money that was paid to the wife for supporting children and making sure that the household still kind of ran the way it used to, stability. Today, I would suggest to you that we don't even really have a need for spousal support in most cases, because both spouses are working. And we have child care through the government. So get to work. Don't raise your children. The state will raise your children. It is a huge shift from a religious, morally based, community-based institution of marriage to the government dictating it. I can't tell you how many people I know who are widows, widowers, who are older, who rely on Social Security that their deceased spouse earned, who end up cohabitating with people. These are people in their 70s and 80s. Why are they doing that? Well, because if they get married, they lose the government benefit of Social Security. Or people who have 3, 4, 5 children together, who live together, because if they get married, they lose the government benefit of whatever kind of food support or housing support you get. So the religious institution of marriage has been kind of twisted to a secular institution, and the parameters of it are dictated by government benefits. Let's fast forward to another change. The Supreme Court decided that that the religious constraints of one man, one woman constituting a marriage was in violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, and therefore people of the same gender can get married. That happened, we'll go over it a few years ago. Okay, so homosexual marriage became a thing. Now that is absolutely outside of a religious marriage, because remember, a religious marriage was for stability, for procreation, for a family unit to then operate within a community and make it strong. Now, I know I am not woke, but I'm pretty sure people of the same gender can't procreate. They can adopt. There can be artificial insemination. There can be surrogate mothers. But basic biology is they can't procreate, which was one of the big reasons for marriage in the first place. So again, the state has interjected its definition of marriage and further changed this whole religious marriage thing. Are there religious institutions that will perform and welcome homosexual marriages? Sure there are. And those are changes within those religious institutions that mirror what's going on in the secular world with marriage. Let's take it one step further. So if it's okay to marry same sex, why can't we have polygamy? Justice Kennedy, in his decision that allowed or changed the definition of marriage, said that marriage is based on love. There are many cases now going through the court system, particularly out in the state of Utah, that challenge laws that criminalize polygamy. Because if love is the standard, and a polygamist says, I can love more than one person, why isn't that a violation of the Equal Protection Clause? And some courts have already said it is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause, so you can have polygamy. A lot of people will say, well, that's a slippery slope argument. You're saying, what if? Well, we'll tell you in the law that what we do is logic. And if your premise, your base point, can be taken to its logical conclusion with every what if that's out there, and it still makes sense, then you have a good premise. You have a good starting point. But if you take that premise and you carry it out to its logical conclusion, like polygamy, or marrying your goat, or marrying your horse, or marrying a child, and it doesn't make sense, well then your premise is faulty. So anybody who says to you, slippery slope arguments are ridiculous, is really upending everything we have in American jurisprudence that's based on logic. You can't carry it to its logical conclusion, and it makes sense, then guess what? It's not a good premise. Start over again. That's kind of where we are with homosexual marriage right now. That polygamy is now the next shoe to drop, and pedophilia being normalized is the next. And maybe it won't happen tomorrow. But it is the course, the logical course, that is next to happen. When that happens, religious marriage really becomes obsolete. Kind of a cute little thing that used to happen in the past. So today, where we are, is the state dictates the terms, conditions to marry, and the terms and conditions for terminating that marriage in response to social changes that happened in the 1960s and 70s. Okay? We'll talk more about what marriage is and these broader concepts as we get more into the book. But I just wanted you to have a good outline of where we are today, what the history of marriage was, and we'll fill in some of the blanks, especially when we get to alimony, and where we're going. Why is it that we have a juvenile court? Why is it that we have guidelines for paying child support? Why does the state take a piece of that? In case you didn't know, spoiler alert, anybody who pays child support pays a fee to the state and the county for handling their money. poorly, by the way. So all along this process, the state is benefiting, but the whole institution of marriage suffered. So, all right, I'm going to leave it there. That's your first week's lecture. This will be posted on Blackboard, and then you can do the discussions and the little essay question that I have posted for you. Okay? And that's how I'm taking attendance, so please turn everything in. Okay? All right. Thanks so much.